Right, I may give you another 1 minute just to see the attendees, and then within a minute time, I will start today's webinar. As most of the attendees audience today try to join and attending within 1 to 2 minutes time, I'm just giving another minute. Right, let me start today's webinar. Good afternoon, evening, and morning to all, and welcome to this webinar. Thank you for the audience today who responded to our invitation and have dialed in to the webinar. We are delighted to be here. HKA and Clyde Co will share a valuable lesson and learned and insight for the upcoming situation in 2021. We also honored to be working together with 해외건설협회, International Contractors Association of Korea for the last couple of years. Spine organization for overseas construction projects and Korean contractors. The session today is running for 1.5 hours. We have 1 hour seminar and half an hour for panel discussion and ad hoc question and answers from the audience. The seminar will be 2 stages. As stage 1 by HKA, reflections on major causes of delay and financial loss in 2020 based on actual project data called HKA 2020 CRUX Insight report. And stage 2 by Clyde Co. The topic will be potential disputes hotspots as the construction market moves to a new normal and its key steps to mitigate the risks. Then the webinar will end with the panel discussion and Q&A. So before we start, we have several housekeeping issues. Next slide, please. Please keep on mute and video disabled. Should be listen in only mode. All attendees are muted. It's by default from the master. Also, during the webinar, you can put your questions. So you can send in your question using the chat or question box at any point during the webinar. Also, during the webinar, we'll give 3 poll questions. So we may launch poll at any point during the webinar, but mostly before the presentation. So once you're done answering the poll, then submit your answer. The poll question has 1 minute to answer, and see the result and share the likely meaning therein. Prior to the seminar session, I'm delighted to introduce the 5 prestigious presenters. The first speaker is Mr. Benjamin Highfield. He's a partner and continent head of HKA business in Asia and the Middle East, with 20 years experience in engineering claims and arbitration. Benjamin is regularly quoted in the industry press and advises clients on commercial and contractual matters. Following by Ben, second speaker would be Mr. Jon Howes from Clyde Co. He's ranked as a next generation partner in Singapore for construction, recognized by Legal 500 Asia Pacific Guide 2021. And he's a fellow of the Chartered Institute of Arbitrators. Jon advises on major energy and infrastructure projects in the Asia Pacific region and around the world, with a focus on supporting project delivery and resolving disputes. The third speaker is Mr. Jon Howes. Jon has worked in Asia since 2000, and he is one of the region's leading construction lawyers. Jon is the joint head of Asia Pacific Projects and Construction Group at Clyde Co. He advises and presents employers, contractors, and consultants who are involved in major built environment, infrastructure, and energy projects. And also, I'm very pleased and honored to introduce our guest panelist, Dr. Chang-Woo Park from Seoul National University. Dr. Chang-Woo Park is a principal professor of the Engineering Project Management Program and Camp EPM at the Seoul National University. His main research interest focused on engineering and construction project management. Lastly, a panelist from HKA is Mr. Maximilian Benz. Maxi is a chartered quantity surveyor and an experienced contract manager with a decade of experience working for professional quantity surveying consultancies with contractors and developers. In the last 6 years, Max has focused on layering his experience with expert witness work for quantum matters in formal disputes. Max has worked on a number of iconic projects globally, from leisure entertainment to major airport developments. For the poll question, now over to you, Ben.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning. Absolutely delighted to be here today. A huge thank you to ICAK for supporting this webinar. I hope you find it of interest. I reiterate, I would be really happy for the attendees to write questions in the chat box so that we can respond to them during the panel discussion. I'm also delighted to be here with Clyde Co and to Seoul National University. I'm going to start with a presentation on claims and dispute management, but really with a focus on actual data from 2020. I think there's a bit of an echo, so could all the other speakers mute their microphones? But to begin with, we're going to start with a poll. And the question is, in respect to project completion, what does the audience expect the employer's approach to delay be after COVID-19? Would they require the contractor to accelerate the works at their own cost? Would they require the contractor to accelerate works paid by the employer? Or would they prefer to award an EOT with no requirement for acceleration? So what does the audience think that the employers will require as COVID goes away? You have 20 seconds to vote.
네, 지금 벤자민 씨가 악셀러레이션으로 갈 것이냐 아니면 EOT 어워드로 갈 것이냐에 대해서 물어보셨고요. 또 악셀러레이션 안에서도 보상을 받고 할 수 있는지 아니면 at own cost로 가야 되는지 그거에 관해서 의견을 여쭤보고 있습니다.
Okay, Crystal, should we close the poll? Let's see. Well, that's a very, very interesting result. The majority of the audience, 59%, estimates that the employers would prefer to award an extension of time, and they're not looking to recover the delays on the project. 33% of the audience and I imagine that 33% comes from contractors, believes that the employer is going to require them to accelerate the works at their own cost. And a hopeful 7% of you believe that the contractor will be required to accelerate the works and get compensated for it. I think a very, very interesting result. And from a HKA perspective, what we have found is that the majority on this case is probably correct. There are a number of extension of time being awarded, but for the most part, no requests to accelerate the works. Okay, Crystal, can I move on to the slides? Okay, I'll take control. Okay, just a little bit about me. I've already been introduced. I'm delighted particularly to be speaking to a Korean audience. I've been working with Korean clients for more than 10 years now, and I generally work in and out of Korea 4 or 5 times a year, hoping after the pandemic I can come back. But I really focus on major disputes, complex disputes and arbitrations, and I represent a number of my Korean clients in settling major issues with the owner organizations on typically EPC contracts. Just trying to move the slide. A little bit about HKA. I think most of the audience know us well. We're an award-winning business. We're independently recognized as the world's #1 provider of construction experts, and we're listed in other organizations such as Global Arbitration Review and the Australian Institute of Project Management. We're nearly a 50-year-old company with offices across 40 different countries and over 1,000 experts working for our business. So on the agenda today, we're going to look at the CRUX Insight. I'm going to talk about the findings of what actually happened in 2020 and these are actual projects in Asia and projects with Korean organizations. And then following the findings of that, we're going to talk about a strategy, how to deal with those specific issues that arose during COVID, and also what can be done in the future to help mitigate some of the risks that we've identified during a COVID year. So just talking to CRUX. So CRUX is HKA's integrated research program that collects and analyzes data on claims and disputes in the built environment. We've looked at over 700 projects. These are live projects, and the data that goes into CRUX is actual data from disputes across these 700 projects with a total of $1.2 trillion US. It is probably the largest database in the world that collects data across claims and disputes matters. To be clear, it's anonymous, so specific client names are not included and don't form part of the database. So it is anonymous, but the findings are something that we have used to study where disputes are arising in the industry, principally from a causation perspective. And just focusing in on Asia, for this particular seminar, I've highlighted 4 countries. I think it's quite interesting because it's 4 countries in Asia, but from completely different parts of Asia, including India, South Korea, Malaysia, and Turkey. And what's interesting is there's some consistency, but there's also changes as well. And if we focus on South Korea, the biggest cause of disputes for EPC contractors and also general contractors, buildings constructors across every sector, shipbuilding, buildings, infrastructure, offshore and onshore, is change in scope. So it's where a scope has been defined by an owner and that scope has been changed during the concurrency of the contract. And for the most part, what we're finding is the scope is agreed as a change. So there's not a dispute over whether the scope has been agreed or not. It is a dispute over the valuation and the impact of that change in scope. The second big issue is incomplete design. So this is either on a buildings project where the design should be completed by the employer, or from an oil and gas perspective where the feed, the front end engineering design contains errors, emissions, and problems within that feed design. And it leads to the contractor presenting a solution that is not accepted by the employer, and then it becomes a dispute. The third one, access to site. It's an obvious one, but it's prevalent across the world. We find this a lot, particularly on rail projects, because rail projects are linear and they cross a great distance, and it's difficult to get complete access to site for the whole project. So you have design is incomplete, you also have design is incorrect. The final one is operational performance. So these are your BOOT type contracts where the contractor then has a role in operating the product. It tends to arise in power stations principally, but it also can be in rail systems, in hospitals, and during operations there are disputes that arise. These are the main areas that we're finding, particularly in South Korea and amongst South Korean entities. Just looking at the difference between quantum engineering and delay. Okay, sorry, the slides are a bit glitchy. Let me just bring it back. So looking at quantum engineering and delay. So what disputes are arising with quantum claims only? What disputes are arising out of engineering matters, and what disputes are causing delay? And you can see that the majority of the disputes involve both delay and quantum issues, and a minority are disputes arising out of engineering. But for the most part, we come back to the same issue of change in scope. So a change in scope is not just costing more money to the project, but of course it's delaying the project as well. So the impact really of fast tracking projects, not doing due diligence, entering into contracts early, and really just trying to get a project off the ground before it's ready to be off is having the greatest impact on Korean contractors in the market. Just looking at the comparison between settled and not settled. So in 2020, during a COVID years, of the disputes that HKA were appointed on, 19% of those disputes were settled within the year. 47% of the disputes were not settled, and the remainder is ongoing. So a not settled dispute essentially would be one which is then referred to arbitration, and an ongoing matter would be one where settlement discussions are ongoing. And again, we have this issue of change of scope and design, but other issues are coming into it as well. So it seems like there's a good appetite to settle physical condition claims and to overcome design issues. But again, this idea of access to site and the requirement on contractors to manage situations where they don't have full access to site results in disputes, and those disputes are regularly not settled. Typically, we're finding that disputes are settling much more slowly during the pandemic than they would ordinarily be settled. We think the reason for that is employers are trying to understand when this pandemic ends, and they want to understand their total liability. So it may be that it's an oil and gas facility and the liability stretches across a number of projects. So they're waiting to see their total liability. Just moving on quickly, what different pathways are being used. So across the projects that we're on, these are the different pathways, 14 projects in negotiation, 2 projects in adjudication, 21 projects in arbitration, and 3 projects in litigation. And really what this slide tells us, for those of you in this audience, and particularly Koreans in this audience, if you go back 10 years ago, these numbers would be very different. You would probably have 80–90% in negotiation and maybe 5 or 10% in arbitration. So the culture of dispute resolution amongst Korean organizations has grown towards arbitration. So we're seeing much more disputes moving to arbitration, not only moving to arbitration, but moving much more quickly to arbitration. So instead of waiting for 2 years after a project is closed, arbitrations are now regularly being launched at 60–70% through the project duration. So what do we do with all these facts that have come to the fore arising out of a COVID year? Well, I'll give you a few tips about some of the typical ideas of claims avoidance and management strategy, and then I'll finish on what one does in relation to using technology in dispute resolution. So you have different claims, as we know, available to you if you're a contractor and you've suffered under this situation, and as an employer, these are the kind of claims that you might receive. They're obvious to most of the audience, of course: extension of time, prolongation, disruption, material price escalation, disputed variations are the major candidates. Interestingly, material price escalation at this time is one that's growing. The odd thing that we're seeing currently in the market is, even though we're in a pandemic, because of difficulties in movement of goods and equipment, we're actually seeing an escalation of materials, which was the opposite of really what a lot of the pundits were predicting. And of course, you have remedies available to you. Modern standard forms of contract contain remedies to compensate contractors in relation to bona fide and verified claims that are made in accordance with the contract. It's important to note that the remedies are designed to deal with the problem at the time it occurs. It's no good identifying a loss that's been sustained during COVID. It may be that you cannot move your labor onto site. It may be that your supply chain is severely delayed. You can't deal with those matters later. The contract envisages that you deal with these matters at the time they happen. And I urge everyone in the audience to make sure that you're compliant in that regard, because failure to adhere to timeframes and quality requirements and the procedures in the contract act as a condition precedent often to getting your entitlement. And that's a real problem at the moment, because a number of our clients have been waiting to see the effects of COVID and coming to the end of the pandemic before they actually notify, and really what they should have done is done so in the middle of the pandemic. A key element to it, of course, being the fact that supply chains are disrupted at this time, is extension of time. And of course, most of these contracts have an extension of time clause. The clause keeps alive the employer's right to LDs. It gives the contractor release from LDs. You don't have to prove loss by and large. This is set out in the contract. It is predetermined as long as it's a pre-estimate, a genuine pre-estimate. There's no requirement to actually look at actual loss for the most part. And of course, there's a limit on liability. But the key element to preparing an extension of time clause, if you do have delays and disruption, is you have to identify an event. Now, in my experience in the last 12 months, it's not good enough just to identify COVID and to say we're in a pandemic. You have to be specific. And when you investigate it, it may not be that COVID is the driving delay to the project. So you really have to understand what is driving the project. Who has liability for the event? What's the contractual entitlement? And you really have to look at compliance under the contract. And of course, the big part of extension of time is cause and effect. So you can't say, for example, the employer didn't give me access to site when in fact your subcontractor was not even mobilized to the site at that time. You have to be sure that the effect complained of is as a result of the cause complained of. And so you have to make that causal link, and you have to do so by way of delay analysis. It's the only way to do it. And doing delay analysis either in Primavera or using contemporaneous records. Another big element as part of the COVID year is productivity. I think we all know what productivity, but it's the rate at which work is performed. It's the production of unit effort divided by the input. And in a COVID year, of course, where you have issues such as social distancing, additional health checks, restrictions on movement of people, restrictions on the quality of labor because you can't get the quality to site. Productivity analysis is a really important part of understanding where your losses lie, notifying the employer, and trying to understand whether it's compensable under the contract. So it's often measured in outputs, meters of concrete placed, meters cubed of formwork, drainage units. It can be linear, it can be by volume, and the inputs are usually the hours that you put in. So if you're digging a hole, is it 10 hours to dig the hole? Is it 20 hours to dig the hole? Because of social distancing, does it take more time? These are things that you really need to understand have dramatically affected projects during this COVID year. So just to finish off with, in terms of my presentation, we all know about the importance of records. I'm probably not the only consultant that have mentioned records to you, and no doubt any of you have heard my seminars before, but it's really important to have contemporaneous evidence supporting a party's assertion that event has occurred. Excel spreadsheets don't work. What you need is actual primary data that talks to the timing, duration, progress, cost, and productivity of operations. In short, you need records to support your assertion. And there's two types really for EOT claims. People really think about as-built data, but it's not just as-built data. It's details of how the works were planned to be carried out, as planned program, method statements, resources planned related to the program. And really, just to finish off, I want to talk about the use of technology. When we're assigned, we come to project, we work with our Korean clients, there are huge technological limitations. And what that means, in short, is that you cannot prove your case if you have no system to manage your contemporaneous records. And so if you're thinking about technology, you need to think about the cost, the scale, the lack of use cases. Think about the magnitude. and try and focus on changing this resistance to change that organizations have when it comes to technology. A good fact, in 2019, 90% of the contractors surveyed do not specifically budget for innovation. We come to project, deal with these disputes, and there's no innovation. Everything is supplied to us by email or Excel spreadsheet. This is not the kind of innovation that we're looking for. What you need in order to advance your case and manage your risk is the right tool. And in deciding your right tool, you need how to then execute it. And finally, that leads you to a solution. So what kind of tool do you need? You need one that tracks your budgets, your costs, your changes to your budgets, the contracts you have and the commitments you've made, but not only the contracts you've had, but the changes to the contracts. And it's not just about your contemporaneous record, it's about logging potential change, giving notification and change modification. And it goes to the past, but also the future, requests for proposals, field instructions, and then it looks at both indirect, direct costs and manages risks. So these are the kind of technology that any contractor, not just Korean contractors, but any contractor should be looking at. And it should, of course, track all of your contemporaneous records as listed out in this slide. And really, finally, how we as HKA recommend when making a recommendation on a platform that is suitable not only for project management, but also at the end of a project, in the event you get to a dispute. You need a portfolio program. So it's a program and project management. It has to be 100% web-based, zero footprint, all in one. And it should have out-of-the-box features. So you don't need to be designing add-ons to it. It comes out of the box and should be able to move across multiple platforms because we all use multiple platforms. It should not be wedded to one platform such as Google or the like. And it should be an international platform. It should not just be English-based and responsive to design. So this is really what you need to be looking for to deal with COVID risks and to look into the future. Well, that's it from me. Thanks so much. I'm now delighted to pass on to Sean Hardy for the next stage of this presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Ben. Really interesting. And hello, everyone. And just to reiterate Ben's comments, thanks very much to ICAK, also to HKA. So on to part 2, potential dispute hotspots as the construction market moves to a new normal and key steps to mitigating the risks. Thank you, Arnold, for the introduction earlier. So I'll be brief here, but as Arnold said, I'm Sean Hardy. I'm a partner in the Projects and Construction Group at Clyde Co, based in Singapore. I'll be delivering roughly the first half of this part of the session. I'll then be handing over to my colleague Jon Howes, who is partner and joint head of APAC Projects and Construction at Clyde Co. He'll deliver the second half. Jon and I do an awful lot, particularly for Korean contractors in the APAC region, but also beyond that. We very much hope to be up in Seoul soon, and I've really missed the trips up there since the start of the pandemic. Clyde Co are, of course, we're one of the leading construction firms. A recent little award, we were actually the only international firm ranked Tier 1 for construction in Singapore in the recent Legal 500 Asia Pacific Guide. So with that, I'm going to summarize the content for this part. I'm going to talk a bit about trends for this year. So where Ben was looking backwards to pre-pandemic and then the early days of the pandemic, we're going to be looking forward. and we're going to be looking at some dispute hotspots for this year and possibly beyond, particularly in connection with the pandemic and very much from a legal perspective. So I'll talk a bit about the first two dispute hotspots as we see it, COVID-related disruption and confusion arising from that. But the second one, terminations and renegotiations. I'll then pass over to Jon Howes, who will talk about challenges arising from acceleration, also joint ventures coming under stress, and Jon will wrap up talking a bit about mitigating the risks. But before we talk about trends for this year, we're going to run the second poll, please. Thank you. So there's no right answer here, and I think it's a mixed picture. The question is, what do you think we will see in the construction sector in 2021? And please select one option: an increase in disputes compared to 2020, a decrease in disputes compared to 2020, or roughly the same amount of disputes as in 2020. So we'll just give you a few moments, please, to select your answer. No correct answer, as I say. So I think now, if we could please close the poll and publish the results. Right, so we've got 72% think there'll be an increase in disputes, only 13% a decrease, 16% roughly the same. So quite a pessimistic audience. I would say that we generally share that view. I do think it's a mixed picture, which I'll come on to, but certainly that's consistent with our view. So if we talk a bit about that now, if we could close the poll and go on to the next slide. Here we are. So trends as we see it for this year. Firstly, of course, continuing COVID-related disruption, and perhaps that disruption is going to continue a lot longer than people originally hoped. Certainly, I think there are signs of some parties adapting quite well to that disruption, but clearly the safe distancing and other preventative measures are, of course, going to have a continuing impact this year. Government support is generally still in place, but very jurisdiction specific, of course, regarding the details, but it is just decreasing. In Singapore, for example, it's already starting to taper off. COVID-related relief under contracts may be coming to an end, in the sense it may no longer be available. Some parties may be looking to accelerate, and Ben touched on that earlier. And so we do think there's a significant chance of more parties getting into financial difficulties this year. Interestingly, in Singapore, there were actually less insolvencies in the construction sector in 2020 compared to 2019, which is quite surprising given the additional pressures of the pandemic. That's generally attributed to the extensive government support that parties had in Singapore. So there is a view that there may be a bit of a rebound now in 2021 as that government support falls away, with unfortunately more parties getting into financial difficulties. And that is likely to be mirrored in other jurisdictions as well. So I do think it's a mixed picture, and there's a lot of uncertainty, and the timeframes are still very unclear, although there's of course optimism around the vaccine and a lessening of travel restrictions hopefully soon. But sadly, we do think that some contracts and relationships are going to be reaching crisis point this year. So on to dispute hotspot number one. Now, as I say, this is very much in addition, very much focused on the pandemic and with a legal slant. I've talked about disruption. Ben talked about loss of productivity, and as I say, certainly that's going to be continuing. It's an issue that's not going away very quickly. One thing we are seeing is that, notwithstanding the continuing uncertainty, some contractors are now under pressure to submit fully supported interim claims and to prove entitlements, whereas last year they weren't being pressed to do so after putting in their initial notices. That can pose challenges. It can crystallize disputes. For example, if there were defects in the notices that went in last year, and employers are now using that for a basis to reject interim claims, clearly there's a potential there for disputes. And one issue that we did see occasionally last year was some contractors being a bit too narrow and selective in their citing of contractual entitlements for notice purposes. So room for some problems there. Finally, a big one, confusion and disagreement regarding concurrent COVID and non-COVID related delay and disruption events. I think this is a really big one. All of those top dispute causing events, which Ben was talking about earlier, around design issues, change in scope, and so on, none of that has gone away. And of course, you've got the impact of the COVID shutdown and suspension of projects, and then disruption on top of all those events which sadly cause delay to projects in more normal times. And we're seeing a number of cases where, for example, employers are rejecting interim claims because they're saying the contractor has failed to divide up and identify which delay was COVID related and which was something else entirely, related to some completely different issue. And if those non-COVID and COVID delay events are treated differently under the contract in terms of entitlements, that can cause an awful lot of problems. So sadly, we do see room for disputes there. Dispute hotspot 2, terminations and renegotiations. Now, as I mentioned, in some cases, relief under contracts in relation to the pandemic is no longer available or will be coming to an end. And certainly we're seeing parties have recently been coming under pressure to perform. Just one example of a case that we're advising on at the moment, it's to do with a supply contract. The projects in Bangladesh, both the main project and the supply contract in turn was suspended. The project then got up and running early in the fourth quarter of last year, and our client has been putting pressure on the supplier now to perform. Sadly, the supplier's position is that due to material price increases, which is a big issue, and again, Ben mentioned that earlier, but also financial difficulties because of the pandemic, it just doesn't make commercial sense for that supplier to perform, and the supplier is trying to renegotiate a way out of the contract and possibly to terminate the contract. So a very difficult situation to be in. Now, key considerations in terms of possible termination are mitigating delay and then maximizing chances of recovery. So unfortunately, for our client on the Bangladesh project, it may well be that the best way forward is to terminate the supplier, get an alternative supplier in, even though there'll be significant additional cost. That should mitigate, hopefully, the overall delay to the project. And if that is done properly, it will also maximize the chances of being able to recover losses from the terminator supplier later on. It's a very complex area, termination, and whenever it's in the mix, you do of course have to look very carefully at your contractual entitlements. Typically you will have contractual express entitlements to terminate, for example, when the works haven't been progressed or there's been a suspension for a specific number of days, or possibly when the other party, the counterparty is insolvent, and then there'll typically be a contractual mechanism dealing with the repercussions of the termination and compensation. So need to look very carefully at that, and be mindful that in English, Singapore and other common law systems, separately to that contractual right, you may have the ability to terminate what is known as repudiatory breach. So that's an extremely serious breach, a fundamental breach, such as completely abandoning the works. And in some cases, terminating under the common law, as we say, for repudiatory breach can be more advantageous, for example, in terms of the losses that can be recovered. But a very knotty legal area, and certainly we recommend getting legal advice whenever termination is in the mix. Now, what we've also seen a lot of, and expect to continue this year, is that either before considering termination or often in parallel to considering terminating, contractors and other parties are looking to renegotiate their agreements, or exploring whether, if they give the supplier or subcontractor, for example, some additional relief, perhaps a bit more time, or a price increase, will that encourage them to perform? And that's all can be a very good way forward if you can reach an amicable a resolution, but just have to be extremely careful if you are considering termination, that when exploring additional relief and renegotiation, that you don't do anything to do what is known as affirming the contract, which means treating it as continuing, because you can then lose the right to terminate by accepting a repudiatory breach. So a very difficult area, and unfortunately a real hotspot for disputes. So with that, I'm going to pass over to my colleague, Jon Howes. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Sean. We're very proud of Sean as our next generation partner. I think I must be the last generation partner. That's how things are defined. But a pleasure to be here and a pleasure to address you. I won't introduce myself, as Sean has already introduced me and has introduced Clyde & Co. Like Sean, I have done in the past and am currently doing quite a lot of work with Korean contractors, which I very much enjoy doing. And I'm very much looking forward to getting back to Seoul at some point, hopefully this year, for a glass or two of soju. So I'm got the challenge of talking to you for probably 3 or 4 minutes about acceleration and issues around acceleration. So let me first start by just framing the issue. Obviously, construction contracts, as we all know, have completion dates. There will be a completion date, usually with an extension of time mechanism, as Ben has told us about, so that if there is an event which delays the contractor from completion, and it's an event which the employer takes the risk of, then there's an extension of time and the completion date moves back. However, it is not always the case that the contractor is entitled to an extension of time. And perhaps more importantly than that, there is often, very often, perhaps it's the norm in my experience, that the contractor may be entitled or feel that he is entitled to an extension of time, but no extension of time has been granted. The employer might be refusing to grant an extension of time, or the employer might still be assessing it. So the contractor is very often faced in a position where he's late and he doesn't yet know whether he's going to get an extension of time, and he needs to decide whether to speed up, which of course is what acceleration is. Acceleration means speeding up the works to achieve an earlier completion date. And of course, that creates costs because the contractor will incur greater costs if it carries out the work faster. And one gets into the issue then of, are those costs recoverable? So what I've set down there is broadly 3 types of acceleration. Voluntary acceleration means the contractor has made up its own mind, it's going to accelerate. So it's not actually asking the employer, it hasn't been instructed by the employer to accelerate, it is simply deciding to do so. And that might be something that a contractor decides to do if, for example, it's late, it doesn't think it's entitled to an extension of time, and it doesn't want to pay liquidated damages. So voluntary acceleration. Instructed acceleration, which is the next category, is a situation where the employer has told the contractor to accelerate. So there has been an instruction from the employer. Now, in those circumstances, usually, again, I'm talking in very, very general terms now, but generally the contractor will recover the costs. You need to look carefully at the notice provisions. You need to make sure that the employer is entitled to instruct acceleration, but you would normally be entitled to be paid for acceleration as a variation or some other measure. We then head on to probably the most difficult area, which is what's called constructive acceleration. Now, constructive acceleration is the situation where the contractor is entitled to an extension of time, or thinks he's entitled to an extension of time, and the employer says, I want you to accelerate. So the contractor doesn't have to accelerate under the contract because he's entitled to an extension of time. He can finish later. The employer says to the contractor, I want you to accelerate. But the employer doesn't say, which is the difference between that and instructed acceleration, I'm going to pay for it. The employer might say, I don't believe you're entitled to an extension of time, but I want you to finish on time nonetheless. And we get into a very difficult situation there in deciding whether the contractor is entitled in those circumstances to recover the costs of constructive acceleration. And the short answer to that question is it very much depends on the circumstances, and it depends in what legal system you are operating in. If you're working under the English legal system, or generally in the common law system, there's a line of case law that says if the contractor is entitled to an extension of time, but that extension of time has not been granted, and the employer makes a request to the contractor to accelerate, the contractor is not generally entitled to costs, because what the contractor is fully entitled to do is to say, no, I don't have to accelerate, I'm entitled to an extension of time. If you don't give it to me, Mr. Employer, I will take you to dispute and I will get my extension of time. If the contractor decides that he's going to accelerate in those circumstances, then he doesn't recover the cost, typically under the English system. Personally, I think that's a very harsh approach of the courts to take, because it places the contractor in quite a difficult position. And it doesn't apply in all jurisdictions. In the American jurisdictions, for example, there is much more room for constructive acceleration. What I would say is, if as a contractor you find yourself in that position, it's very important to very carefully control your correspondence with the employer, and writing some careful letters that say, look, I think I'm entitled to an extension of time. You are telling me to accelerate in order to meet an earlier completion date than I'm obliged to do. I'm going to do that, but I'm going to expect you to pay for it. Now, if as a contractor you write that sort of letter, you're much more likely to recover your costs of accelerating. When you don't recover costs is the situation where you're entitled to an extension of time, you decide you're going to take measures to accelerate, and you haven't been told by the employer, nor have you asked the employer or told the employer what you're doing. So very important to manage the situation carefully if you're dealing with acceleration and you're looking to recover acceleration costs in circumstances where you haven't got a clear instruction from the employer to accelerate. Right, I knew I'd mess up the slides, but I've managed to get to the right slide now. Next hotspot, which I'll deal with quite quickly, not because it's more difficult, but it's simpler, but because it is equally complicated, and we find it an increasing cause of disputes. But there are some very simple tips that we can give you. If a project gets into distress and you are working on that project in joint venture, it is much more likely that you're going to end up in dispute with your joint venture partners, unfortunately. That's one of the facts of life. If one of the joint venture partners becomes insolvent, then you may find yourself in difficulty. If the joint venture partners differ according to how to deal with situations around delay and disruption, as I was talking about earlier, that's also going to give you provision. There are some key points that need to be included in joint venture agreements. We say, when we're drafting joint venture agreements, it's incredibly important to have clauses like the clauses that I've listed there. Is there a provision that allows one of the joint venture partners to take over the performance of the works where a partner becomes unable to perform? Similarly, if one of the joint venture partners comes into financial difficulties, is it possible for that joint venture partner to be replaced or for the other joint venture partner to take over? Number one, and we see this time and time again, is there a clear route for escalating and resolving disputes? You need a joint venture agreement that is clear about what you do if there is a dispute, and how it is to be resolved, but also what you're doing while that dispute is being resolved. If it's no good having in your joint venture agreement a provision for arbitration, which is going to resolve disputes between the joint venture partners, if typically an arbitration will take you somewhere between 6 months if you're lucky and 3 years if you're unlucky. So what you need is a provision whereby the JV leader or whoever can make decisions, and so disputes can be resolved quickly, albeit temporarily, while the JV is continuing with the works. And finally, what do you do if you're in a JV agreement where actually some of these clauses are missing? And unfortunately, that is often the case. For me, the sensible thing there is to talk to your JV partners. It's in neither of your interests to end up in a position where the contract is compromised. You might have disputes between the JV about who's responsible for delays and that kind of thing. But the important thing is, through whatever means, to resolve what you're doing and make sure that the job that you've contracted to do is treated properly. And the approach that's taken, whether that is continuing with the job, whether it's terminating, whether it's applying for acceleration costs or what have you, is dealt with so that you deal with the situation that you find yourself in together as JV partners. So some very quick tips before we move to the Q&A on mitigating risks. As always, very careful contract administration. Ben's talked about information and records and notices. It's particularly critical at the moment when you're dealing with COVID. You must be sure that you've got your notices in, you've got your records. And if you're dealing with COVID-related claims, it's important, we say, to look very carefully at the contract and to make clear about the basis of your claim and what you're entitled to. Often you'll find that, for example, a force majeure clause may entitle you to time but not money, and that kind of thing. So it's quite important when you're administering the contract to make sure, from a legal point of view, on what basis you are making claims. Accurate records, tracking progress, tracking costs with a regularly updated program and proper records. If you've got that, you are 90% of the way there to bringing a good claim. If you haven't kept good records of progress and you haven't got a regularly updated program, you are going to find yourself in difficulties when you're in negotiation with the employer or when you're in arbitration. Final tip, press the supply chain to perform. What we were seeing and are seeing increasingly in the COVID situation is the difficulty of managing a supply chain. If you're a main contractor, you've got subcontractors, you've got suppliers, you may well be in a position where you've got different entitlements in your supply and your subcontract. You've got different provisions as to termination. You've got different provisions as to force majeure, suspension, and that kind of thing. Unfortunately, those problems are there, and you can't necessarily do anything about them. Hopefully, for next time, you will know better, and you will know the importance of making sure all your contracts down the supply chain are back to back. But the one tip that we give to main contractors that are finding themselves in distressed projects is manage your supply chain. So if you can manage it under the contract, if you then do so. If not, you may have to renegotiate contracts, or you may have to terminate suppliers or subcontractors. But you have to take an active role in doing so. You've got to manage your risk, you've got to mitigate your losses, and you've also got to make sure that you perform the contract to the best of your abilities if you're going to have a chance of reaching a satisfactory solution to a financial point of view with the employer at the end of the job. That's all that I've got to say at this stage, so I'll hand back to Arnold, if I may. I think we've got another panel question, Arnold, and then we're going to the Q&A.
Thank you, John. It was very valuable, the presentation, especially for the disruption, government support and relief, constructive acceleration issues, financial difficulties, and JV issues to the crisis and related to the contractual issues and the law. Before moving to the third poll question, I may encourage today's audience to post the questions so that we can answer the question. So please feel free to post your questions during our panel discussion. Okay, third poll question is, the global construction industry will recover to pre-COVID investment and activity levels. One, in 2021. Number two, in 2022. Number three, in 2023 or later. 코비드 직전에 이루어진 수많은 공사 행위들, 프로젝트 엑스큐션 관련돼서 또 투자 관련돼서 언제쯤 경기 회복과 맞물려 그 어느 연도에 회복이 이루어질지 예측되는 항목에 대해서 체크를 해 주시면 감사하겠습니다. Do we have a result? For the answer to the result, I may pass to Dr. Chang-Woo Park. Could you give us your likely views on this? Possible?
Hi, I'm Chang-Woo Park. It's very, very interesting result. There is too much uncertainty in the issue of the pandemic response. We have vaccines, but it's hard to predict the pandemic. We can't have but wish for a speedy recovery. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for that. So
Yeah.
I believe the most result putting into 2021 will be the year likely been recovered. So that indicates as well, from my point of view, we need to careful until such a time, keeping the important contemporaneous records and the programs or the relevant evidence. So should be careful on that approach. Please give me just 1 minute. Let me see the questions. I think I have one.
We can close the poll now.
I can see one question from Mr. Ramakrishnan Manovalan. Sorry for if I'm making the pronunciation for your names. The question is, nowadays lump sum contracts are being released for turnkey projects. After the pandemic, is it the lump sum contract become obsolete?
I'm happy to take a first go at that, but it may be that
Thank
other
you,
panelists have other thoughts. My sense of the market, and you know, I see the market in Singapore and Hong Kong. I tend to see the back end of the market because I tend to do more disputes than contract drafting. but my sense is that lump sum contracts, as opposed to remeasurement contracts, are becoming probably more common. That's certainly my sense of things. That you know, employers want cost certainty. Obviously, a lump sum contract becomes, you know, creates more risk to the contractor. But my sense over the past few years certainly is that we have moved away generally from traditional contracts with employers design. We're moving more towards design and build, and we're moving more towards lump sum contracts. So certainly that's, you know, I certainly don't see lump sum contracts becoming less common. But that's, you know, that's my impression. What I've seen, it may be that Mr. Park has some impression, or indeed Max or Ben.
Yeah, I think I agree with you there, John. I would say they're probably becoming more common. They're definitely within Asia becoming more common. I think the big factor for the clients is it mitigates risks to a certain degree and hands that down through the contract to the contractor. From a contractor's perspective, though, I think they need to be very careful when agreeing these contracts to make sure they're mitigating any potential risks within the contract, ensuring there's adequate contingency in the contracts there.
It's interesting this question has come up because I actually had a call with a Korean client yesterday, and they were talking about the fact that the biggest nightmare contract they had was a cost plus contract. And I think for all of us on this call who are contractors, the goal is to get cost plus because you feel like you can't lose money. I think the other panelists need to mute microphones. And this particular client and friend of mine was saying that it's been a nightmare during the pandemic in particular, because of course, the employers suddenly recognizing the fact that he is paying for a whole team to essentially be suspended whilst the supply chain has broken down due to COVID. And because of that, there are far more challenges to the actual costs that are being paid. Also, from a valuation point of view, sometimes, as you know, you buy plant items that their whole life cycle is just for one project. And other times, those plant items, the whole life cycle is expected to go beyond the project. And from a cost plus basis, that's a bit of a nightmare. So if you're buying a tower crane and you expect it to both be used to deliver your project and then the next two projects, and then after that you would scrap it, you obviously have to take the value of a third of that tower crane, for example, on one project, a third on another, and a third on another. But then, of course, in a pandemic situation where the project is then prolonged, it may be that the tower crane life is consumed within the one project. And so whilst all of us don't enjoy being forced into lump sums, at least sometimes that gives you certainty and you really understand the number you're working with. So there's a plus and a minus for everything. And I just thought it was a really interesting example of where a cost plus contract, which you think is exactly what you want, can be so difficult under a pandemic circumstance. I don't know if anyone else has any comments on that, but that's really all from me. You muted, Arnold.
Thank you, Ben, for the useful answers for those questions. Meanwhile, whilst we waiting for another questions, I may, for the panel discussion, I may start with the question to Dr. Chang-Woo Park. I believe you've been undertaking a research for the engineering and construction projects in the university. So in this regard, how would you give your general view for today's presentation and also the risk in the overseas project from your perspective and views? Please.
Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. Today is calling to sort of I proceed my statement. 반갑습니다. 오늘 웨비나를 통해 HK와 사이더스 에코의 유익한 정보를 얻었습니다. 그리고 전문가들의 견해를 접하게 되어 감사합니다.
Great to see you all here. Today, this webinar has been a great source of information from the HKA and Co. And thank you for coming in contact with the opinions of experts here.
네, 특히 2020년 크룩스 인사이트 레포트는 해외 건설 사업이 지속 가능한 비즈니스로 정착하기 위해 밸류와 리스크를 한눈에 확인할 수 있어서 좋았습니다.
In particular, the 2020 CRUX Insight report was very good to see at a glance the values and risks for the overseas construction business and how it turns to a sustainable business.
저는 대학에서 엔지니어링과 컨스트럭션 프로젝트를 연구하는 입장에서 세 가지만 말씀드리겠습니다.
I would like to tell you three things from the standpoint of researching engineering and construction project at university.
자, 첫 번째는 엔지니어링과 컨스트럭션 비즈니스의 프로젝트 에코시스템입니다. 자, 컨스트럭션 인더스트리 에코시스템 측면에서의 접근도 중요하지만 컨스트럭션 프로젝트의 특성을 이해하고 비즈니스를 접근해야 지속 가능한 성과를 창출할 수 있다고 봅니다.
First, it is the project ecosystem of engineering and construction business. Although the approach from the aspect of the construction industry ecosystem is also important, you must understand the characteristics of the construction project and approach the business in order to create a sustainable results.
이를 이해 못한다면 비즈니스 환경에서 클레임과 분쟁으로 비즈니스 리스크가 증가할 수밖에 없습니다.
In a business environment that doesn't understand this, claims and disputes inevitably increase business risk.
둘째는 해외 건설의 프로젝트 매니지먼트 역량입니다. 특히 해외 건설은 현지의 그라운드 룰을 이해하고 스테이크홀더 매니지먼트가 아주 중요한데 우리 컨스트럭션 엔지니어들은 이 부분이 좀 약한 것 같습니다.
Secondly, it is the project management capability of overseas construction. Especially for overseas construction, understanding the local ground rules, stakeholder management is very important. However, we construction engineers seem to be a bit weak in this part.
2020년 크룩스 인사이트 레포트에서도 클레임과 분쟁의 가장 중요한 원인은 공사 계약 내용의 변화입니다. 이는 컨스트럭션 프로젝트 워크의 대표적인 특성입니다. 매니징하지 않으면 반드시 실패하게 되어 있는 것입니다.
In the 2020 CRUX Insight report, the biggest cause of claims and dispute is changing in construction contract details. This is a representative characteristic of construction project work. So if you don't manage, clearly you will surely fail.
자, 프로젝트 리퀘어먼트를 분석하여 커뮤니케이션 리스크를 대응해야 합니다. 직접적으로 이러한 리스크를 대응하면 좋지만 이는 사전적 예방을 위한 전문가의 지원이 더욱 절실해 보입니다. 자체 역량을 지속적으로 키우면 좋겠지만 우리 건설 산업의 특성상 이런 부분이 어려울 것 같습니다.
Analyzing the project requirements and respond to communication risk is very important. It is good to directly respond to these risks, but it seems more urgently needed from experts for proactive prevention. I believe there will be many difficulties due to the nature of the construction industry to continuously develop our own capabilities.
셋째는 코비드-19 팬데믹 이슈입니다. 포스트 팬데믹 시대는 우리 BIM을 넘어서 스마트 컨스트럭션이 해외 건설 경쟁력의 중심에 있다고 생각합니다.
Thirdly, there is this mega issue of COVID-19. In the post-pandemic era, I believe the smart construction is at the center of overseas construction competitiveness beyond the building information modeling, well known to us as BIM.
엔지니어링과 컨스트럭션 프로젝트의 디지털 트랜스포메이션은 인공지능 등 신기술 적용뿐만 아니라 일하는 방식과 관리 방식도 함께 진화될 것입니다.
And the digital transformation of the engineering and construction project will not only apply new technologies such as AI, but also evolve with the working method and, more importantly, the managing method.
해외 건설 사업이 고부 가치를 창출하고 지속 가능한 비즈니스 성장하기 위해서는 이에 대한 선제적 대응이 아주 중요하다고 생각합니다.
I firmly believe it is important to preemptively respond to overseas construction projects in order to create high added value and grow into a sustainable business.
자, 오늘 많은 분들이 참석하셨는데 유익한 시간이었습니다. 이상입니다. 고맙습니다.
Thank you all for attending today's webinar. It was a great time with you all, and I will end here. Thank you.
Arnold, you're muted.
Thank you, Dr. Chang Park, your useful comments and then the views on that. Before we moving to the second question, I have a same other question from Mr. Manavalan. It is about the investment project in the overseas. His question is, investment project in overseas is more stressed than dealing within the country. How to deal with the delay? Who's going to answer? Maybe a little bit vague to answer.
Maybe I'll start, and I'll pass on to my legal colleagues to sort of finish on this one. Yeah, I mean, I've worked both inside of Korea on disputes and outside of Korea. I wish everyone could act in the way that the Korean domestic market acts, where there are very few disputes and matters are resolved quite quickly. In terms of overseas disputes and delay, it really is a country to country basis in terms of how to approach and how to resolve. And I'm sure Sean and John can speak on the sort of legal differences between different regions. But what I would say from a delay perspective, the answer is quite simple. Make sure you put your notices in when an event happens that are at the risk of the other party in the contract. And for the most part, the contract requires you to put those notices in. And if you don't put them in, then you waive your right. So number one golden rule, submit your notices. And I get a lot of feedback that clients are afraid of submitting notices, but when you've lost $100 million, you know, who cares? Second is keep good contemporaneous records. When I use the word contemporaneous, I mean records that were made at the time the matter was happening. So I'm not talking about records that were created later on. And that really talks to having a good project management system, a web-based, cloud-based system where records can be held, they can be shared in real time, and they can be stored for many years to come, because the reality of a number of these projects, particularly the larger ones, is that the disputes and not resolved for some time. And if you get to a point where the project is closed from a construction point of view, and those project records suddenly become unavailable because they were not stored on the cloud and they were stored on people's laptops, that dramatically weakens the opportunity to prove cause and effect. Jon, Sean, anything to add from a legal perspective?
Go on, Sean.
I just think those principles are universal, frankly. And as you said, Ben, it's very, well, firstly, it's very jurisdiction specific. It's also very fact specific and specific to the relationship that you're dealing with as to how you address these problems. Hopefully, and Ben has focused on being able to resolve them within the four corners of the contract with the existing relief mechanisms. As I touched on earlier, in more extreme situations, you may need to consider more extreme solutions around termination or possibly some sort of negotiation completely outside of the contract if you have to. So very fact specific. And certainly just the Singapore context, perhaps some similarities there. Parties have been well protected so far, particularly by government interventions, but also by authorities interventions and what have you. So hopefully in Singapore we won't see too many extreme solutions like that, which, as we said earlier, are likely to result in disputes when you're talking about termination and things like that. So I think that's all from me. Any thoughts, Jon?
No, I think you covered it. I mean, I think it is very situation specific. I give two pieces of advice: know your contract if you're working overseas, and know the law of the jurisdiction that you're operating in. You've really got to do your homework as well as do all the good housekeeping that Ben and Sean have talked about.
I think you're on mute, Arnold.
Arnold, you're on mute.
Okay, now it's not working properly. All right, thank you, Sean, Jon. I have another question from Mr. Yeon-Suk Lee. He's asking about the terms and conditions on especially the time limits of force majeure. So he's mainly asking for time limit of force majeure are not defined in the normal EPC contract. However, this pandemic persists for such a long time period as abnormal cases. Then will international law interpretation of this be any beneficial to the contractor? Max, if you have any initial view on this, maybe you can comment and then move to Sean and Jon. What do you think?
Certainly. I think I've worked on, you mute your microphone, please, Don. I've worked on a number of force majeure matters. I think there's a few factors that you definitely need to consider. One is largely contracts tend to only allow for time and not compensation. And if they do, it's very difficult to gather the required data for that. So the importance of records there is very important. So I'd say also the period of the force majeure on construction projects, what I've seen from my experience has been that actual lockdowns have not been too long in terms of the stopping of works. For instance, in Singapore, we had a period of approximately 72 days. where works could not proceed on site in around March 2020. So in terms of that, there's not actually too much disruption to the works, but what disruption to the works did occur, the contractors really need to ensure that they've got adequate records for loss in productivity or stand down, as it may be, and then looking to the contract really for the force majeure clause to what they can claim in that instance. From a legal perspective, I wouldn't be able to answer that, so I'll pass you on to either Sean or John.
Shall I get the ball rolling and then Sean can chip in and tell me what I've got wrong? Again, it's going to depend very much on which law you're operating under. If you're operating under the common law, that's the law that you'll find in England, Singapore, Hong Kong, Australia, there is no legal doctrine of force majeure. So there will only be a force majeure solution if there is an FM clause in your contract. And you need to look very carefully at the contract to see whether or not there is a force majeure clause, and if so, what it covers. You tend to get two types of force majeure clause. You get force majeure clauses which are prescriptive and say these and only these events are force majeure, or you also get some force majeure clauses which are more open, where they say an event which is beyond the control and not reasonably foreseeable by the contractor or the employer, and might give some illustrations of the type of thing that might constitute force majeure, but they are not restricted to those things. So you will usually, not always, but usually have a force majeure clause in your contract, and that clause will be typically prescriptive as to what you need to do. You may need to give notice. Typically, it may say that you may be entitled to suspend works on notice, and if the FM situation goes on for a certain period of time, you may be entitled to terminate. But it'll be entirely a question of what the contract says. If there is no force majeure clause, then you're in more difficulty, and you start to need to look at concepts like frustration, impossibility, those kinds of things, which I haven't really got time to go through in a talk of this nature, but you will only have FM if it's in the contract. There are other civil law jurisdictions. I have to say I don't know about Korea, but I do happen to know that China, for example, in the Chinese civil code and in the code of the UAE, you will find that force majeure is in there as a feature of the civil code. So if you find yourself in a situation where you are unable to perform the contract because of something that has occurred after the contract which has started and which was not reasonably predictable, you may be excused performance. That's all I can think of. It may be that Sean and others have something to add.
No, I think that's spot on, John. I can see there's one more interesting question, Arnold. I wasn't sure if you wanted to move on to that, given the time. Arnold, yeah.
Okay. You know, the reaction time is a little bit slower. So, okay. I just found a really interesting and quite practical and feasible question that most of the contractors in the overseas project would be in the same situation, especially regarding this time bar issues and then the subsequent evidence. The question is, if the contract requires notice and details to be submitted within a specific time, contractor did provide the notice, but not the details as the event was ongoing. Does this lead to the time bar? Sean or John? Yep, please, Sean.
Yeah, if I have first stab at that. Yeah, it's a very common issue and yet you'll have this obligation to provide further particulars after the notice. Whether it is a time bar will depend on the wording of the clause. So yes, there are nasty contracts. It's possible. Often the notice itself is a condition precedent, so you lose the right. Sometimes you may see the provision of further particulars is also a condition precedent, and if you fail to provide them, arguably you lose the entitlement. But it's a common issue even pre-COVID, and we normally give sort of the advice that you do your best to provide the further particulars. And if you're not able to, you prepare a paper trail, you write carefully prepared letters explaining why you're unable to provide the particulars. For example, classic would be you just cannot quantify the total delay because it's ongoing. And that's all you can do, I think, in that situation if you've got a nasty condition precedent regarding particulars. So don't sit back and be passive, like John's original earlier point. Try to actively manage that risk and write a letter, explain what you're doing, explain when you can't provide those particulars or further details as the question phrased it.
The only thing that I'd add to that is, and I have to say I don't know the answer to this, but you sometimes see the kind of clause that says you have to give notice within a very short period, and you have to provide full particulars of all effects of the delay within 14 days. And one of the questions that's always intrigued me is supposing you can't, because you don't know what the full effects of the delay will be. A more normal clause would be if it's a continuing effect, you can continue giving notices. But I have seen those sorts of clauses around where you say you've got to give full details within 14 days, 28 days, or what have you. My sense is that if you could not give full details, you might have an argument in law to say, well, this was something which wasn't my fault. This was something with which I could not comply, and therefore I am not time bound. So you might well have that argument. I certainly don't advise you to put yourself in that position. I would 100% endorse Sean's advice that if you've got one of those clauses, put particulars in. They don't need to be complete. They don't need, but at least do something to put particulars in. But I've always found that quite an interesting question.
It took exactly 6 seconds to return. Okay, thank you, John, for useful advice. It's already 5:08, so even though we still got a few questions, I think I may answer the emails later on and summarize and get the list of the questions which not answered. So I think to wrap up today's webinar, considering the key messages from the presentations made today and the panel discussions and then Q&A, we have observed, let me just summarize the technical point of view, change in scope, delaying, and costing as well. So it indicates have to carefully review the engineering risk through the key supply chains and subcontractors, not only for internal contractors issues. So have to really be careful your the third parties, the environment and their potential risk. And also we talked about concurrent delay and contractors culpable delays, which will be competing with the COVID, mainly COVID caused critical events. So depend on how to prove your evidence with the programs and schedules. So your project will be risk So have to be careful with the contemporary records and information. Also, from my experience last year, when I conducted COVID-19 EOT claims, I particularly remember out of 10, say two important messages I can say is the concurrent delay, which already existed, culpable to the contractor's delay. And second one was the key supply chains and subcontractors keeping record. Only receiving the notice letter relating to the COVID never be enough. But I really found some of the contractors considered that would be fine, but which maybe not. And also we today discussed about disruption, the constructive acceleration, government support and relief, and the financial difficulties and JV issues to the prices and related to the contract and law, and non-COVID related delay and termination issues and renegotiation without affirming contract condition. So it was useful, and also to get the question from today's audience. I think that this brings us to the end of our webinar today. We again thank you for ICAK and also for Clyde Co, Jon Howes and Sean Hardy, and our guest panelist, Dr. Chang-Woo Park and Benjamin Highfield and Max Benz from HKA. In addition to those questions today, if you have further questions, still please, you can email directly to us. We'll answer to that. So that's all from us today. Again, thank you for participating in the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.